The moment you stopped explaining yourself, people didn't get curious, they got uncomfortable. Not because you were wrong, but because you no longer needed their permission to exist. Wholeness threatens fragmented minds because it exposes what fragmentation is designed to hide. Most people do not live as a unified self. They live as divided beings split between who they are allowed to be and who they actually are. One part adapts, obeys, performs, and survives. Another part remains buried, angry, creative, fearful, tender, ambitious, or honest. This division becomes normal. Over time, it feels safer to remain incomplete than to risk becoming whole. When someone enters this psychological environment carrying inner coherence, something destabilizing happens. A whole person does not need to constantly adjust their personality to match the room. Their thoughts, emotions, values, and actions move in the same direction. There is less inner negotiation, less self-betrayal, less need for approval. This alignment is not loud, but it is unmistakable. And to fragmented minds, it feels like a threat. Fragmented minds depend on contradiction to survive. They say one thing and feel another. They believe one value publicly and live another privately. This internal split creates tension, but it also creates familiarity. Wholeness disrupts that familiarity. It reveals that living divided is not inevitable. It is a choice made unconsciously, often inherited from family, culture, or fear. This is why wholeness often provokes hostility rather than admiration. People do not respond to what you say, they respond to what your presence implies. Your integration silently asks a dangerous question: why are you still divided? And that question is rarely welcomed. A fragmented mind cannot tolerate mirrors when it encounters someone who has integrated their contradiction's strength. Vulnerability, discipline, and compassion shadow and light it, feels exposed. The comparison is not intellectual, it is visceral. It touches old wounds, repressed desires, and abandoned potentials. Instead of confronting those inner conflicts, the mind looks for an external target. Projection begins here. What cannot be owned internally is assigned externally. Your confidence becomes arrogance. Your calm becomes coldness. Your boundaries become selfishness. Your independence becomes threat. The fragmented mind is not lying, it genuinely experiences discomfort. But instead of tracing the discomfort inward, it pushes it outward and labels you as the problem. This is why wholeness is often misunderstood as superiority. A whole person is not trying to dominate. They simply do not need to fragment themselves to belong. And for those whose identity depends on mutual fragmentation, this feels like betrayal. Social systems unconsciously reward fragmentation. They value compliance over integrity, adaptation over authenticity, harmony over truth. Wholeness disrupts these systems because it refuses to play along. A whole person does not attack the system, but their existence questions it. Their refusal to self-abandon highlights how much self-abandonment is required to maintain the status quo. Fragmented minds also fear responsibility. Integration demands accountability. When you become whole, you can no longer blame one part of yourself for what another part does. You must own your desires, your limits, your shadow, your power. Many people are not ready for this level of self-confrontation. Seeing someone who has taken that step reminds them of the cost of avoidance. This is why wholeness can feel lonely. Not because it isolates you, but because it removes you from unconscious agreements. You are no longer bonded by shared denial. You no longer participate in collective self-deception. Conversations change, relationships strain, familiar dynamics dissolve. And those who remain fragmented often interpret this shift as rejection, even when none was intended. Yet wholeness is not an act of aggression. It is an act of integration. It does not seek to expose others, but it cannot help reflecting what stands before it. The discomfort it causes is not created, it is revealed. Fragmented minds survive by keeping parts of themselves in exile. Wholeness threatens that survival strategy. It suggests that exile is not protection but imprisonment. And for those who have built their identity around division, that suggestion feels intolerable. So resistance appears, criticism sharpens, distance grows. Not because wholeness is wrong, but because it is destabilizing. It removes excuses. It removes illusions. It removes the comfort of pretending that inner conflict is unavoidable. Wholeness does not demand imitation. It demands awareness. And awareness is precisely what fragmentation exists. To avoid hatred is rarely a spontaneous emotion. It is not born from clarity, strength, or certainty. Hatred is a reaction, a defensive structure built to protect the psyche from something it cannot face directly. When examined closely, hatred reveals more about the one who carries it than the one who receives it. It is not an expression of power, but a signal of inner threat. The human mind is organized around self-preservation. When an experience, person, or idea threatens the internal balance of the psyche, defenses activate automatically. Hatred is one of the most effective of these defenses because it simplifies complexity. It turns discomfort into certainty, confusion into blame, and inner conflict into an external enemy. Instead of asking painful questions, the mind chooses a target. This is why hatred often appears in situations where reflection would be more appropriate. Encountering someone who embodies qualities we have repressed creates tension. Their presence stirs what was buried unlived ambition, denied vulnerability, unexpressed anger, or unclaimed strength. These emerging feelings are destabilizing. The psyche, seeking relief, reframes the source of. Disturbance is dangerous or wrong. Hatred provides that reframing. By hating, the mind avoids introspection. It no longer has to ask, why does this person affect me so deeply? It can now say, this person is the problem. The emotional charge remains, but the responsibility is shifted outward. This externalization is not conscious manipulation, it is an unconscious survival strategy. Hatred also protects identity. Many people build their sense of self around roles, beliefs, or limitations that feel safe. When someone challenges those structures simply by existing differently, it creates identity anxiety. If another way of being is possible, then the old way may no longer be necessary. That realization threatens the narrative a person has relied on to make sense of their life. Hatred rushes in to defend that narrative from collapse. This is why hatred often feels righteous. It convinces the person that they are morally superior, justified, or protecting something valuable. In reality, they are protecting their own psychological equilibrium. The stronger the hatred, the more fragile the inner structure often is. Hatred is also fueled by projection. Qualities that are unacceptable to the conscious self are pushed into the unconscious. When those same qualities appear in another person, they are immediately recognized and rejected. The recognition is accurate, but the ownership is missing. Instead of saying, this exists in me, the mind says, this exists in you and must be destroyed. Hatred becomes a way to attack parts of oneself without acknowledging them. This mechanism explains why hatred is often disproportionate. The reaction does not match the situation, because it is not about the situation. It is about a deeper internal conflict that has found an outlet. The target becomes a symbol rather than a cause. Hatred also creates psychological distance. It allows the individual to feel separate, protected, and above the perceived threat. This distance feels safe, but it comes at a cost. Hatred narrows perception. It produces curiosity, empathy, and complexity. Over time, it hardens the psyche, making growth increasingly difficult. What makes hatred particularly seductive is that it offers immediate relief. The discomfort disappears temporarily. The inner tension seems resolved, but nothing has been integrated. The unresolved material remains active beneath the surface, waiting for the next trigger. This is why hatred often repeats itself, moving from one target to another. In contrast, confronting the source of hatred requires courage. It demands that a person turn inward and examine what has been stirred. It asks for accountability, humility, and honesty. These qualities are far more threatening to the ego than hostility ever could be. Hatred is not the opposite of love. Indifference is. Hatred is charged, intimate, and emotionally invested. It reveals attachment to what is being denied. Where there is hatred, there is unresolved connection. Understanding hatred as a psychological defense does not excuse harm, but it explains its origin. It shifts the focus from moral judgment to inner dynamics. It reveals that behind every act of hatred lies a refusal to see something within oneself that feels too dangerous, too painful, or too destabilizing. To acknowledge individuation invites opposition because it disrupts the invisible agreements that hold people together at an unconscious level. Most relationships, systems, and communities are not built on truth, but on mutual adaptation. People learn early which parts of themselves are acceptable and which must be hidden in order to belong. Over time, this self-editing becomes automatic. Identity forms not around authenticity, but around survival. Individuation begins the moment a person stops living exclusively through borrowed values and external expectations. It is not rebellion for the sake of conflict, nor is it an attempt to appear different. It is the slow, often painful process of becoming aligned with one's inner reality. This alignment breaks the unspoken contract of conformity, and when that contract is broken, resistance follows. Opposition does not arise because the individuating person is attacking others. It arises because their presence destabilizes collective comfort. When someone chooses to live according to their inner truth, they expose how much self-suppression is required to maintain the group identity. Their choices silently question the sacrifices others have made to belong. This is why individuation is often interpreted as betrayal. Families feel abandoned. Friends feel judged. Institutions feel challenged. The individuating individual may say very little, yet their actions speak loudly. They are no longer predictable. They no longer play their assigned role. And predictability threatens structures that rely on psychological sameness. Opposition also arises because individuation removes emotional leverage. When a person is internally anchored, guilt, shame, and approval lose their power. This shift is deeply unsettling for those who depend on these mechanisms to maintain control or connection. The individuated person is harder to manipulate because they no longer outsource their worth. Many people unconsciously prefer others to remain fragmented because fragmentation keeps relationships stable. When everyone suppresses the same truths, harmony is maintained. Individuation breaks this symmetry. It introduces asymmetry, growth, and tension. The system reacts the way all systems do when disturbed. It attempts to restore balance, often by pushing the change agent back into conformity. Criticism becomes a tool of correction. Labels replace understanding. The individuating person is described as selfish, distant, unrealistic, or arrogant. These labels are not objective assessments. They are attempts to reduce complexity and reassert control. By shrinking the individuating individual into a negative identity, the system protects itself from further disruption. Individuation also reveals fear in others, fear of being left behind, fear of having to confront their own unlived life, fear of discovering that the limitations they accepted were never absolute. Watching someone step into a fuller version of themselves can awaken regret and envy. These emotions are difficult to tolerate, so they are often transformed into opposition. This is why individuation can feel isolating even when surrounded by people. Familiar bonds begin to loosen. Conversations feel misaligned. All dynamics stop working. The individuating individual may grieve these losses, not because the process is wrong, but because growth always demands separation from what no longer fits. Yet, individuation is not a rejection of others. It is a commitment to psychological integrity. It does not require agreement, but it does require honesty. And honesty threatens environments built on avoidance. Opposition is not a sign of failure in this process. It is evidence that something real is happening. If no resistance appears, it often means the individuation is superficial or still safely within the boundaries of acceptance. Deep individuation touches taboo areas: desire, power, anger, vulnerability, autonomy. These are not neutral territories. They provoke strong reactions. Over time, opposition serves a clarifying function. It reveals which relationships are based on genuine connection and which depend on self-betrayal. It exposes where loyalty was conditional and where acceptance required diminishment. This clarity, though painful, is necessary for psychological maturity. Individuation does not guarantee peace. It guarantees meaning. It replaces the comfort of belonging with the stability of inner alignment. The opposition it invites is the price paid for becoming a self rather than a role, a truth rather than a performance. A living psyche rather than a borrowed identity projection creates enemies by turning inner conflict into external threat. The mind has a limited tolerance for contradiction, guilt, desire, and fear. When certain traits, impulses, or emotions cannot be integrated into the conscious self-image, they are pushed out of awareness. They do not disappear, they relocate once externalized. They are no longer experienced as parts of the self, but as qualities embodied by others. This process is automatic and largely unconscious. The psyche seeks coherence, and when coherence cannot be achieved internally, it is simulated externally. The world becomes divided into acceptable and unacceptable figures, allies and enemies. What feels dangerous inside is perceived as dangerous outside. The enemy is not chosen at random, it is psychologically precise. People are often targeted not for what they do, but for what they represent. A person who expresses freedom may attract hostility from those who feel trapped. Someone who embodies discipline may provoke resentment in those avoiding responsibility. A person who is emotionally open may unsettle those who survive by emotional numbness. The reaction is rarely about behavior. It is about resonance. Projection allows the individual to preserve a stable self-image. By locating unwanted traits in another person, the ego can maintain its narrative of goodness, innocence, or victimhood. This narrative feels essential to psychological survival. Admitting that the same traits exist internally would threaten the identity structure the person relies on. Projection occurs, hostility becomes justified, the enemy feels real, dangerous, and deserving of attack. Moral language often appears at this stage. The projected qualities are framed not just as undesirable, but as evil, corrupt, or inferior. This moralization further distances the individual from self-examination and reinforces the illusion of righteousness. Projection also simplifies complexity. Inner life is messy, contradictory, and difficult to manage. External enemies are easier to deal with. They can be blamed, avoided, punished, or destroyed. This gives the psyche a sense of control it lacks internally. The cost of this simplification is accuracy. Reality becomes distorted to fit the projection. This is why enemies created through projection often seem exaggerated or symbolic. The reaction does not match the stimulus. Small actions provoke extreme responses. Minor differences are experienced as existential threats. The intensity reveals that something deeper is at stake than the immediate situation. Projection is contagious. Groups bond through shared enemies. Collective identity often forms not around shared values, but around shared rejection. The projected material becomes a focal point for cohesion. This dynamic explains why entire communities can direct disproportionate hatred toward individuals or groups who carry symbolic meaning. The enemy becomes a container for everything the group cannot face about itself. Projection also resists correction. Facts rarely dissolve it. Evidence is reinterpreted to support the narrative. Challenges are experienced as further proof of the enemy's danger. This closed loop protects the psyche from confronting the original inner conflict. Ironically, the qualities that are projected are often precisely those needed for growth. The anger that is condemned externally may be the assertiveness needed internally. The independence that is attacked may be the autonomy that has been suppressed. The creativity that is ridiculed may be the vitality that was sacrificed for safety. By projecting these traits outward, the individual remains stagnant while attacking the very forces that could bring development. Projection creates enemies not because enemies are necessary, but because integration feels impossible. The psyche chooses conflict over confrontation with itself. It chooses certainty over complexity. It chooses blame over responsibility. Recognizing projection is destabilizing because it collapses the distance between self and other. It demands humility and courage. It requires acknowledging that what is most disturbing outside may be intimately familiar inside. Few are willing to make this move voluntarily. As long as projection remains unconscious, enemies will continue to appear. They will change faces, names, and contexts, but the emotional pattern will repeat. The world will seem hostile, unjust, and threatening, while the true source of disturbance remains untouched within the psyche, silently shaping perception. Reaction on judgment integrity is misread as arrogance because it refuses to perform the rituals of insecurity that many people mistake for humility. A person with integrity does not constantly seek reassurance, does not over-explain their boundaries, and does not shrink their convictions to make others comfortable. This quiet self-alignment can feel unsettling in environments where worth is negotiated through approval and self-doubt. Many social interactions are built on subtle displays of submission. People born through shared uncertainty, shared complaints, and shared self-minimization. When someone does not participate in this pattern, they stand out. Not because they are superior, but because they are internally anchored. This anchoring is often misinterpreted as pride. Integrity means one's inner values and outer actions are aligned. There is less contradiction, less performance, less need to adjust identity depending on the audience. This consistency creates predictability, but it also removes the familiar cues of insecurity that others use to feel safe. When those cues are absent, discomfort arises. People often expect humility to look like hesitation. They expect kindness to come with self-erasure. They expect confidence to be softened by constant disclaimers. When someone is clear without apology, calm without submission, or firm without aggression, it disrupts these expectations. The disruption is quickly labeled as arrogance. This misreading is intensified. In cultures and systems that reward conformity, integrity threatens these systems because it does not bend easily. A person who acts from internal principles cannot be easily swayed by social pressure, guilt, or fear of rejection. This autonomy is perceived as defiance, even when none is intended. Arrogance seeks dominance. Integrity seeks coherence. The difference lies in motivation. Arrogance needs to prove superiority. Integrity does not need to prove anything. It simply acts in accordance with inner truth. Yet to those who rely on external validation, this lack of performance feels dismissive. Projection plays a significant role here. People who struggle with self-doubt often project arrogance onto those who display self-trust. What they are reacting to is not pride, but the absence of visible insecurity. That absence highlights their own internal instability. Instead of confronting that discomfort, they label it. Integrity also limits access. A person with strong boundaries does not offer unlimited emotional availability. They choose where and how to invest themselves. For those accustomed to blurred boundaries, this selectivity feels like rejection. The rejection quickly transforms into accusation. This is why integrity is often punished in group settings. The individual who refuses to gossip, refuses to compromise core values, or refuses to engage in performative humility is seen as disruptive. They are not loud, but they are immovable. And immovability is threatening in systems built on pressure. Mislabeling integrity as arrogance serves a social function. It discourages others from developing inner alignment. It reinforces the idea that standing firmly in oneself will lead to isolation or judgment. In this way, the label acts as a warning. Stay fragmented, stay agreeable, stay small. Yet, integrity is not coldness. It is not indifference. It is not a lack of empathy. It is the discipline of not betraying oneself to gain approval. It allows for genuine connection because it removes manipulation. Relationships formed around integrity may be fewer, but they are real. The discomfort integrity provokes reveals the emotional economy of the environment. In spaces where insecurity is currency, integrity disrupts the market. It exposes how much energy is spent managing impressions rather than living truthfully. Over time, Those who maintain integrity often stop defending themselves against the charge of arrogance. Explanation rarely works because the accusation is not based on observation, but on emotional reaction. Trying to correct it often leads to further misunderstanding. Integrity stands quietly. It does not argue for its innocence. It does not demand recognition. It remains aligned, even when misinterpreted, knowing that clarity is internal before it is social, and that being understood is not always compatible with being whole.